Those of you who can hear me, lucky you. Those who can't hear me, you probably did that on purpose, so that's fine. But welcome. Just great to see you all tonight, and I'm happy to be back to share again a little more recently than I often am, so I didn't feel the need to do a lot of preamble tonight. But we're actually finishing out the series Thou Shalt Not, as you saw. Because for me, it's always hard to kind of know when a series has run its course. I always think about those Netflix shows that you watch the first few and you're like, this is pretty good. And by the end, you're like, I can't believe this is still going on. So I didn't want to get to that point. But I thought, being the teacher in me, perhaps, I thought to myself, I probably should grade you guys on what you've learned so far. So I will say it this way, that if you now know that the Ten Commandments are found in the Old Testament, I can give you a passing grade for that. That's impressive. If you now know that the Ten Commandments are in the book of Exodus, I can give you a solid C+. Well done. If you now know that the Ten Commandments are actually found in chapter 20 of Exodus, well, that's an A+, and I'm going to assign you an A+ for that. And if you're just now realizing that there are 10 commandments in the Ten Commandments, well, I'll invite you up for prayer at the end, because you should have known that one already. But we're diving back into the Ten Commandments, and it's, I often think of the Ten Commandments, a lot of people think of them as like the user agreement with Apple. It's like this super long document, the laws, it goes on, and there's a lot of thought about, like, I know I accept it. I don't always know what it means. I don't always know like what's all in there, but I click accept because I just got a brand new phone and I'm excited about that. And so we're diving back in. And if you think about the book of Exodus, that's where we're going to start tonight. If you want to find your way there, it's kind of known as the big exit, right? The book of Exodus is about the big exit of the Hebrew people from Pharaoh. And a lot of great stories that we can kind of pick up on. And we know that as soon as they left Pharaoh, as soon as they crossed that Red Sea, they started walking through the desert. And this was a caravan. And this was a caravan probably of like 1 million people. This was a huge group of people. And they ended up making camp after a few weeks at a place called Mount Sinai. And that's where Moses went up to meet with God, and God gave him the law. That's where these tablets you always think of, even the picture that was up there earlier of Moses with those tablets, that's where this is happening. And we know that there's a whole bunch of law. There's chapter after chapter, book after book of law, but this was kind of the top 10, if you will, the ones that God laid out at the beginning stages. And the first time we talked about this, we realized that God's laws weren't there to establish a relationship. They were there because there already was a relationship. That was our main point from week one. And so we were able to understand that this isn't a set of rules that if you do them good enough, God might just accept you, because God had already accepted the people of Israel long before they ever received a single rule or law. And that we learned that relationship came first, and that the law came later. And we know that because of the setup that we saw. That they did not have the law. They did not have anything from God that would be described as commandments until after the fact. And so the first two commandments, we focused on those the second week, and they revolved around these ideas that you shall have no other God before me, and you should not be worshiping idols. And what it was simply saying was you need to put God front and center in your life. And so this was the point that's the point from week one. The point from week two is about obedience. It's that obedience is not something that God wants from us. It's actually something that God wants for us. That God understands that our lives work better when we focus on Him. That our lives are arranged around Him. We will do better. We will be blessed. And so we talked about that, and then last week or a few weeks ago we talked about this idea of misusing God's name. And it maybe wasn't what we thought that meant, but it was really kind of developing our own version of what God wants, and then just kind of attribute it to Him and saying, like, well, this is what God wants. Not because God said it, but because we believed it. And so we ended up saying this: if you're in the habit of pursuing a knowledge of God at the expense of a relationship with God, then you run the risk of missing God. And we can fall in love with the rules and completely miss the rule giver. We can learn all about God, but never really get to know Him. And so that brought us to our fourth commandment. And you may think, well, it's weird that you're ending after 4, but I don't have a lot to say about 5 through 10. Don't steal, don't murder. I'm going to leave you to figure that out on your own. But there was one more I wanted to kind of look at, and that was the fourth commandment. And it's the commandment about the Sabbath, whatever that means, and about keeping it and remembering it. And if you're from my generation, it was really all about Sunday shopping. Does anybody remember that? Were you kind of a cognizant of the world around you in 1992? In Ontario, it was a big deal. The idea that we would allow people to shop on a Sunday apparently breaking the Sabbath, and it was quite the thing that Mr. Ray did. But really, it's hard to summarize this command succinctly. Like, do not steal. It's pretty straightforward, but it's almost like saying, thou shalt take a day off, or thou shalt clock out from time to time. And so we're going to pick it up in Exodus 20, as we have been this whole series, and we're going to start in verse 8, which is the commandment about the Sabbath. And it says this. It begins by simply saying this: remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day it is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigners residing in your towns. You see, Sabbath is an interesting word because it's actually a verb that we and the Bible have converted into a noun. It simply means to rest or to cease from work. And to stop doing something is a verb. And that's the first thing that we remember. First thing I think we need to remember is, as Egyptian slaves, they didn't really get weekends. Like, the idea of taking a day off is very easy for us to understand. And many of us would go like, well, I think I need 2 or 3 days off. And that's understandable. But to people coming out of slavery in Egypt, a day off was not something they would have thought about. They live in a 24/7 society where if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, you don't live. And so that's the society they're coming out of. So this would have been something a little bit shocking to them. And they would have to find food as they traveled. And when the law was given, you're probably looking about 30 or 40 days after the Exodus. So for 30 or 40 days, they probably had some of their own food. They were eating. They were doing the best they can. But we're talking about a whole society of people. There were elderly, there were children, there were infants. There was this entire cross-section of people. And we know that being people, when things weren't going well, what did they start to do? And I love the word the Bible uses. They grumbled. They started to grumble. And here's 3 summaries of what they complained about. The first one was this: I wish God had just killed us instead of rescuing us. They didn't just say, we wish we died rather than be free. They said, why didn't God just kill us there instead of dragging us all the way out here? I guess they were just feeling hangry. But it also says, they said, remember how good the food was, how we were never hungry. This is one of their complaints. And of course, that wasn't true at all. It was a struggle to eat. And then they accused Moses of actually planning. Did I say Marvin? Marvin did not hand out any commandments that I know of. Moses actually... They accused him of purposely bringing them to the desert so he could watch them die. I mean, this is some pretty good grumbling here. They weren't just irritated by it. They were angry about it. And so it's at this moment that God speaks to Moses and tells him what to say to the people. So we're going to actually back up. We were in Exodus 20. Let's just back up to Exodus 16, because this is more of the narrative of kind of how we got here. So Exodus 16, we're going to start in verse 11. I'm reading from the NIV, but yours will be similar if you're not. It said this: the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. I'm not sure that's my response to grumbling after I just rescued a people from Pharaoh, but that was his grace and mercy. He said, listen, you're going to eat meat tonight, you're going to have bread tomorrow. And so this, what might be one of my favorite verses in the Bible, verse 13 says this: that evening quail came and covered the camp. I don't know about you, but I was taught, like, when you read the Bible, try to picture it. I can't wrap my head around this one. What does it mean that quail came? Probably about 1 million quail came. And you probably think, well, they're birds. They flew there, but of course, quail don't really fly very far at all. So I'm left with kind of 2 ideas. Either that you were standing there, and every time you turned around, there was more quail surrounding you, or what I prefer to believe, there was a stampede of quail. That the quail came massively across. There's a huge cloud of dust kicking up beside them. I would like to know how this worked, because the verse, that evening quail came, it sounds like it's your cousin or something. Oh, somebody came. 1 million birds came to visit. But I'll give you my top 5 list real quick. 5 things I would love to see with my own eyes from the Bible. Got to be an empty tomb. Like, who wouldn't want to see the empty tomb, of course? Parting of the Red Sea. That would be an amazing thing to see. Sermon on the Mount, as long as I was sitting up front so I could hear, that would be amazing. I've always said one of my top 5 is when a group of teenagers got mauled by bears for making fun of a bald guy. That's gold to me. That's in there. 2 Kings 2, read it. It's amazing. And then finally, the stampeding of the quail. That's going to be in there for me too. But however that happened, God just brought them meat. Maybe it was in buckets, KFC, but I don't know. But he just brought them for like 1 million people. And then the verse finishes this way. So it says, that evening quail came and covered the camp. In the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, the thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. It is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer, which is actually a lot. It's about 3 pounds. So collect 3 pounds for each person in your tent. And the Israelites, very seldom said in the Bible, the Israelites did what they were told. They did this. And some gathered much and some gathered little, which makes it sound like they weren't listening. But some gathered much, some gathered little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. So no matter how much they collected, they all ended up with the amount they were supposed to have. And it said, everyone has gathered just as much as they needed. And then Moses goes on and gives them an additional instruction. This one's key. He says to them, no one should save any of it until tomorrow. He says, this is what God's provided for you to eat today. He says, eat it today. God will provide some more tomorrow. And of course, everyone did as they were told, which of course never happened in the Old Testament. Instead, they decided, you know what, we'll sneak some extra. We'll put some aside. I'll eat less today just to be sure I've got some tomorrow. And it says anytime anybody tried to do that, they would wake up in the morning and it would smell terrible and it would be filled with maggots and it was just inedible. So they had to learn to collect what they needed and eat what that were provided for them. But then Moses told them this, on the 6th day, I want you to collect a double portion and save half of it overnight, which I would imagine if for most people would have been like, well, this is a bad plan because I've tried saving it overnight. It doesn't keep. But they did what they were told and they kept it till the next morning. And then we're going to pick it up again in verse 29. So Exodus 16:29, it says this, bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. So this was not the law, but this was what God asked them to do so he could provide for them. And so the people did this, and they did this for 40 years. They allowed God to provide for them, and they accepted that they would work for 6 days and they would rest on the 7th. And God gave them this weekly reminder week after week. Because here's what God knew, that one day the Israelites would become a mighty people, a powerful people, who might think to themselves, I don't need to rely on anybody anymore. I don't need God to provide me food. I've got wealth. I can provide for myself. And so for 40 years, God gave them this weekly reminder. This was a day when you would not work, not prepare, not fight for survival. Instead, it would be a day of rest and an acknowledgement of their dependence on him. But you know what was really interesting? God kind of forced it on them. They didn't really have a choice. If they chose to disobey and collect too much, it went bad. And it says that for some people, they would choose to not collect a double portion on the day before Sabbath and figure, oh, we'll just get some tomorrow. And he wouldn't provide it. So I'm guessing within a few weeks of that 40 years, they had figured out that God was going to provide for them. So let's just jump back to Exodus 20, where we were reading the 4th commandment. It says this in verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. See, it was a day of rest, but it was also a day of remembrance. You see, Sabbath is the practice of fasting from work and busyness so that we can feast on the things of God. Sabbath is the practice of fasting from work and busyness so that we can feast on the things of God. And it's important to realize that Sabbath was not created in that moment either. We have to go back further. Sabbath was actually established way back in Genesis, and in fact, all the way back in Genesis chapter 2 at the very, very beginning. And it's interesting, there's two words that the Hebrews use for this word rest in the Bible. And we don't use 2 words, but we have 2 kind of concepts for the word rest, don't we? The first is Shabbat. And Shabbat is this idea of taking a break. It's not working. It's you know, I'm a 54-year-old man, so I have perfected the open mouth on the couch cat nap. Like I can do that at any time. That's resting. We know what resting means in that context, right? But there's another word, And we use the same word, rest, but there's another word, nuach. And nuach means just kind of stay still, to dwell, to settle in. And we kind of use it in this way. I might say, I am resting this Bible on my hand. It doesn't mean the Bible is napping. It doesn't mean it's resting, but it's another use of that same word. And so in Hebrew, they use two separate words. We've just got the one that we use. And so it's this idea of taking a break from resting your body, resting your mind from what you were doing, but then spending some time there to dwell and to settle in. And so the Sabbath wasn't, as I said, established in Exodus 16. That was explained in Exodus 16. Genesis 2, the first 3 verses, are where we find out that God established the Sabbath. It says, "Thus the heaven and the earth were completed in all the vast array. But on the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work and from the creating that he had done." I want you to note that is not a commandment. He did not tell people that they had to do things or not do things on the Sabbath. He said, this day, and I'm going to call it the Sabbath, and we understand now why, because of those two meanings. But he says, I've created this day because as I rested, I want you to rest. Because God understands something about the people that he created. In fact, God understands everything about the people he created. And so he believed in the idea of there being rest for us as well. But verse 3 said this, that God blessed the seventh day and he made it holy. There's two things there. God blessed the Sabbath, he made it holy. So the word blessed, I think we understand fairly well. What does it mean for God to bless a day? Well, ask Ron after if you're not sure. But what it means is if God blesses a man or a woman, then they become rich with his blessing. If he blesses a land, then the land becomes rich with his blessing. If you bless a day, God blesses a day, that means the day becomes rich with blessing. But this word holy, that we use quite a bit in a different context, is the one that kind of caught my idea. So if you would indulge me, I think we have time. I'd like to do a quick version of a view of the Hebrew. All right, I would like to thank our sponsors, but we don't have any. So if you're interested in sponsoring this show, we could upgrade our prizes. I used to get gift cards for contestants, and now we're doing 3 services. So forget it, I can't do it. But somebody recently called me a word nerd for doing all this stuff, and I'm like, thank you. Like I took that as a compliment. But I'm gonna ask for a contestant. You can just stand up where you are, though. You don't have to be on camera. You can just stand up where you are. Somebody who thinks they can worm their way through a Greek word with some clues. Anyone? Bueller? Thank you. There, Lily, there you are. All right, so you ready? Here is your clue. So I don't know if you need any help with anything. Got the middle one. Anybody know what the last symbol is? DoorDash. So they're just called Dash now. They thought, well, DoorDash is too much for millennials to remember, so we'll just go with Dash. So you got the last part pretty good, Kodash. What's missing there? The word way, right? And pretty good, yeah. So in Hebrew, they would pronounce the W with a V, right? So Vakadesh. Very good. You can collect your prize from the cafe after. Vakadesh. It's more commonly actually translated not holy but hallowed. And I thought, well, that doesn't help because I understand the word hallowed less than I understand the word holy. So I kept going, and it says in the New Testament genre, it would be the word sanctified. And I thought, okay, now we're getting somewhere, because sanctified or hallowed means to be set apart from this world. It's to be centered around the things of God. And so that makes sense. That would make sense as a definition of holy. But it's this idea of being brought into God's presence. And again, he's holy, so being in his presence is holy. And it was not a command. It's just a statement of fact. God chose to bless that day and to set it apart as a Sabbath. And we know that Sabbath is the practice, I'm going to say it one more time, of fasting from work and busyness so that we can feast on the things of God. But here's the real problem. Somewhere along the way, the practice of Sabbath went from being a blessing to a burden. Somewhere along the way, it went from being this wonderful gift that God was going to give us to rest the way he had rested, and instead it became this unwanted obligation. Because I can understand that as a Israelite in the desert, how wonderful this must have been. The idea that for one day you spend it in your tent. You spend it with your family, and you know the Jewish traditions, they're amazing traditions. You would have spent time eating together, laughing together, giving God glory. It would have been a wonderful day for them before they went back out and started collecting manna again. And it may surprise you that Sabbath is not nearly mentioned as much in the Old Testament as it is in the New Testament. So I got some more word nerd for you here. It's 154 times you'll find the word Sabbath in the Bible. 58 of them are in the New Testament. But when you consider that the Old Testament is 3 times longer, it means that kind of verse for verse, page by page, it's mentioned more in the New Testament than it ever was in the Old Testament. But it may further surprise you that it's very seldom talked about. So you might think, well, how can it be mentioned 58 times, but they don't talk about it? Well, it's because of this. 33 of the 58 times, the word Sabbath was used in some sort of argument between Jesus or his disciples and the Pharisees. It was usually the topic of irritation, not of lesson. And then the predominant other section of it would be 25 times it was just used to tell people what day of the week it was. So it would say Jesus went to the synagogue on the Sabbath. So it wasn't teaching us about Sabbath. It was telling us when something happened. In fact, there's only 3 times in the New Testament where there's kind of an intentional lesson that was presented about Sabbath. And that may lead you to believe that maybe Jesus didn't think the Sabbath was very important, or maybe he didn't value it. But I would argue it's actually the opposite because of what he said during these debates, during these arguments with the Pharisees. What he said about the Sabbath was very powerful. So we're just going to pull out kind of 3 ideas real quick from that. And the first is this: we are free from the law of Sabbath as believers, but we're not free from the gift of the Sabbath. And the first statement was something actually from Paul, and it's from the book of Colossians. It's chapter 2, verse 16 and 17. It just simply says this: so don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink. We know what that's talking about. Or for celebrating certain holy days, a new moon, or ceremonies, or Sabbaths. He says, don't let anybody condemn you for that. For the rules are only shadows of the reality yet to come. And Christ himself is that reality. Paul is showing us that these Old Testament rules were there for a reason, but that reason was to point towards Christ. And if you think about it, a shadow can't exist without something that casts the shadow. And he says Christ is that someone. Christ is the one who casts the shadow that the law demonstrates for us. And the movement from being a shadow to the reality, that's what Christ says when he says he came to fulfill the law, not to do away with it, not to abolish it, but to fulfill the law. That's what he's talking about. The second point we might pull out is this: that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. And that's an interesting story as well. So let's pick that up in Matthew. We're jumping around a lot here. It's all in Matthew and Mark to finish up here. Matthew 12, the first 13 verses. I'm going to read them quickly because there's a lot here, but I want you to hear the whole story. It says, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. He answered, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? So he's just given them 2 quick examples of where the law did not apply. I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. He's talking about his disciples. And then he says in verse 8, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so you'll often hear people saying that Jesus abolished the Sabbath, got rid of the Sabbath. He did not. Why would he abolish something that he just declared himself to be Lord of? He didn't come to abolish the Sabbath, but to return Sabbath to its rightful place as a blessing to his people. Jesus came to dig out the Sabbath from underneath a mountain of legalism that had taken the meaning away from all of his people. And we saw in verse 7, it says it's a day for showing mercy and a day for doing good. Jesus is saying that Sabbath could not be restricted to an argument about what you can or can't do or who can do what at what time. He said that's not what it was about. He simply said that the Sabbath, he was the Lord of the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was there for his people. And that's the third point. The Sabbath was created for us. Mark 2:27 says this. Then Jesus said to them, sorry, I should explain. This is the same story, but in Mark's recounting of it, he adds this one verse that's so interesting. So he's still talking about the picking of the grain on the Sabbath. He said this, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. That God made the Sabbath as this wonderful gift for his people, and he invites us to take part. And I would have to think it's impossible that a day focused on Jesus should be a burden to a believer when Jesus had just said that. And I would just ask you this, Matthew 11, verse 28 to 30, real quick. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, this is Jesus speaking, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. When Jesus is talking about being a rest for us, I believe he's referring to the Sabbath, a gift that was established in Genesis chapter 2 and has been ongoing ever since. And we've allowed in so many cases the weight and the heaviness of the law to cover up what God intended. He said, I took a day, the seventh day, to rest. I want you to do the same. I invite you to do the same. Remember, this was before the fall. This is back when the Sabbath for Jesus meant walking in the garden with Adam and Eve, dwelling with his people. That's what he invites us to do. And so can I tell you, will God and can God provide for you if you only work 6 days a week? Well, I know how you can find out. You can accept the gift of Sabbath. You can try it for yourself. You may have noticed that we really only have been talking about the purpose of Sabbath, not the practical. And I've done that on purpose because God didn't talk about the practical. God did not instill a bunch of rules. What God kept doing is going back to this idea. There's a purpose for the Sabbath, and it's wonderful, and it's for you. So as followers of Jesus, God doesn't expect us to live up to Israel's laws around Sabbath. However, the wisdom of those laws remain. And the law of the Sabbath, it's rich and is significant for us today, just like it was for the Israelites. Sabbath is not a command we are bound to. It's a promise we're invited to. We Shabbat in order to nuach. We stop working so that we can truly rest in God's presence. Because I believe the Sabbath is the practice of fasting and from work and busyness so that we can feast on the things of God. Let's pray. Lord, just so thankful to be in your word, so thankful to have your word at our fingertips, Lord. Every time we read something new. Every time we read something that we've read many times before, you show us something new. So we're just so thankful for that, Lord. And I would just pray that that a little note about Sabbath would take hold in some hearts, Lord, to think about what it would mean to just accept a gift from God. Wrapped in any other package, we would be so eager. But Sabbath has become so diluted, so made so difficult by how it was treated in the Old Testament that we kind of don't even know what it means. But God, I want to take part. I want to be involved in anything that you would offer as a blessing to me. So we thank you for the Sabbath, and we thank you for your teaching on it. We praise in your name, Jesus. Amen. Well, we're over time, so I can't tell you my Ten Commandments jokes, so I'll just have to dismiss you, unless you guys have a spare 30 seconds. All right. I was nervous, but my premise is this: what would happen if Moses was handing out commandments in the modern age? What would that look like? And I think it would look something like this. First he might go to the Americans and he would say to them, "Hey, I have some commandments for you guys," and they would kind of like have a little private conversation. They would come back and say, "Well, what do you got?" And he said, "How about thou shalt not covet?" And they kind of like, well, I don't know, and then they whisper a little bit more, and they just said, "Listen, we love to, but we can't." Our whole economy is built on coveting. If people don't want what everybody else has, the whole economy is going to fall apart. We can't do it. So Moses thought, okay, you know what? Across the ocean, I'm going to go ask the Russians. And he says, "Listen, guys, who here would like a commandment?" And they said, "Well, what do you have?" And he's like, "How about do not steal?" And they kind of whispered to each other, and they came back and said, "Listen, our whole economy is set up on corruption, and our economy would collapse. We can't do it. We're so sorry." So finally, Moses kind of was getting a little irritated by the whole process. He said, "You know what? I'll go ask the Dutch. I'll go ask the Dutch what they think." And he said to the Dutch, "Hey, guys, would you like a commandment?" And they all kind of looked at each other, and they whispered, and they came back and said, "Well, how much are they?" Moses said, they're free. And they said, great, we'll take 10. Anyway, have a great week.